It's wild to think about how a country's energy sector can go from this absolute golden era, literally building world-renowned massive infrastructure, to a fragmented mess drowning in trillions of rupees of debt. Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack the fascinating and honestly pretty turbulent history of Pakistan's Water and Power Development Authority. You probably know it as WAPDA. We'll look at the economics of a transition that just never quite finished, and figure out why fixing a national power grid is almost never just an engineering problem. All right, let's just jump right in.
So here's our game plan for today. We're going to condense about 60 years of history into 5 quick chapters. The giant builder, the messy unbundling, the IPP trap, the solar death spiral, and finally, powering the future.
Chapter 1. The Giant Builder, Building a Nation's Grid.
Okay, so to really understand this crisis, we've got to look backwards first. See, WAPDA wasn't always this broken up, fragmented thing. It was actually born back in 1958 as a technocratic powerhouse, built specifically to solve some major shortages, and man, they moved fast. By 1960, they had already wrapped up the Warsak Dam. In 67, the Mangla Dam came online, adding a whopping 1,000 megawatts to the grid. And then, in 1976, they finished Tarbela. At the time, that was the world's largest earth-filled dam by volume. I mean, these were absolute engineering marvels that basically became the literal bedrock of the entire grid.
And it worked. By 1990, this totally state-run monopoly had successfully brought electricity to 70% of the population. But, here's the ultimate irony of the whole situation. WAPDA's success actually set the stage for its biggest problem, because suddenly you had this exploding industrial base and a booming population, and demand started surging by like 8 to 10% every single year. They just couldn't build fast enough to keep up, which, as you can guess, led to some really severe load shedding and a lot of very frustrated people.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, the messy unbundling, a fractured transition.
So, fast forward to the 1990s. Between massive transmission losses and a total lack of new dams being built, the government had to pivot. Pushed heavily by international groups, mostly the World Bank, they decided to basically dismantle WAPDA, to try and force some private sector efficiency into the mix. So WAPDA got to keep its water responsibilities, and it held on to those massive dams like Tarbela and Mangla. But everything else? Gone. The thermal plants was spun off into GenCos, transmission was handed over to a brand new national company called NTDC, and the whole consumer distribution side got sliced up into these regional monopolies known as DISCOs.
But here is where things went totally off the rails. This unbundling, it was completely half-baked. Remember those generation companies that inherited the thermal plants? Well, they were never actually privatized. They stayed entirely under government ownership, operating this ancient, wheezing machinery. Just to put that into perspective for you, a modern combined cycle plant today runs at around 55% efficiency. These WAPDA-era relics, they're limping along at maybe 30%. They're literally just burning through massive piles of incredibly expensive fuel to generate just a tiny trickle of electricity.
Unsurprisingly, these reforms failed to deliver on pretty much every single promise. Why? Well, for starters, intense political pushback meant those regional DISCOs were never fully sold off. And that competitive wholesale market that was supposed to magically drive prices down, that never materialized either. Politicians kept this iron grip on the tariffs, and systemic power theft just kept happening unchecked. So instead of getting this sleek, efficient private sector, Pakistan was left with these clunky government monopolies that were just sinking deeper and deeper into debt.
Moving on to Chapter 3, the IPP trap, the take-or-pay disaster.
Now, think about this for a second. Why on earth would you ever pay for electricity that you don't even use? It sounds completely crazy, right? But believe it or not, this exact question highlights the fundamental flaw in the energy contracts that were signed back in the 90s. In 1992, the government was just absolutely desperate to end the blackouts, so they invited private investors to come in and build independent power producers, or IPPs. And it all boils down to something called a take-or-pay contract. To get foreign money in the door, the government agreed to these capacity payments. What that basically means is they guaranteed a fixed dollar index profit to the investors, just for having their power plants built and ready to go. It didn't matter if the national grid actually needed the electricity that day. It didn't matter if they utilized even a single kilowatt. They got paid anyway.
And that brings us to a mind-blowing number. $3 billion. That is roughly how much Pakistan is spending every single year right now just on these capacity payments. Because of this massive signing spree over the decades, the country currently has about 30 to 40% more power capacity than it actually needs, even during peak hours. So they are literally paying billions every year for ghosts in the grid, power they physically cannot and do not use.
And all this overcapacity feeds straight into this monster notoriously known as circular debt. It's basically this devastating domino effect. Step 1. Consumers don't pay their full bills, or maybe the government is late on paying its subsidies. Step 2. Those distribution companies, the discos, run out of cash and can't pay the transmission company. Step 3. The transmission company defaults on the power generators. Step 4. The generators, including those IPPs, suddenly have no money to buy fuel. And finally, power generation just drops off a cliff, which causes blackouts, forcing the government to borrow even more money just to restart the whole vicious cycle.
And the fiscal drain of this cycle is just staggering. Back in 2008, circular debt was essentially near zero. A decade later, in 2018, it hit 1.1 trillion rupees. And by 2023, it exploded to an astronomical 2.3 trillion rupees. That's roughly 8 to 9 billion US dollars. It's turned into this massive economic black hole that is entirely crippling the government's ability to invest in, well, practically anything else.
So, what happens next? Chapter 4, The Solar Death Spiral, The Escape Hatch.
With grid electricity becoming just ridiculously expensive to cover all of these debts, consumers are understandably bailing. Look at Pakistan's industrial electricity prices. They're sitting right around 10 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour. That is double, sometimes even triple, what regional competitors like India, Bangladesh, or China are paying. Businesses are shutting down, and wealthy households are just watching their incomes get eaten alive by their utility bills. They are desperately looking for an escape hatch.
And that escape hatch? It's rooftop solar. The adoption rate has been absolutely explosive. We're talking about solar capacity skyrocketing from a mere 100 megawatts back in 2020 to an estimated 2,000 megawatts by 2024. I mean, it's pure economics. The market got flooded with cheap Chinese panels, which means your payback period on the investment is super fast, like 2 to 4 years. Toss in a really lucrative net metering policy where the grid actually buys back your extra daytime power. It's an absolute no-brainer for anyone who has the upfront cash.
But wait, because here comes the twist. This creates a terrifying economic paradox that experts call the death spiral. See, the folks who are installing all this solar are the wealthy households and the large factories. But those are the exact high-paying customers the grid desperately needs to subsidize the lower-income users and, more importantly, to pay off those massive IPP capacity charges we talked about. So as these big spenders leave the grid, the utilities' revenues totally collapse. To survive, they are forced to hike up the tariffs even more on the poorer customers left behind. And of course, higher prices just make solar even more attractive to whoever is left. It's a crazy loop where the individual's smartest financial move actually accelerates the collapse of the whole public utility.
Okay, Chapter 5, Powering the Future, Tangible Solutions. So how do we fix this? Well, first, we have to completely reframe the way we look at the crisis. As the author of our source material so brilliantly puts it, Pakistan's energy crisis is not a technical problem. It is a governance problem. Actually, hit pause on that for a second, because it's so true. The engineers, they know exactly how to string up transmission lines and build power plants. That's not the issue. What's missing here is the political courage to push through really painful structural reforms instead of just slapping on another short-term band-aid.
The steps forward are definitely going to be brutal, but they are totally necessary. First, the government needs to selectively privatize the high-performing discos and bring in some ruthless professional management to crack down on power theft in the worst-performing ones. Second, they've got to aggressively renegotiate those IPP contracts and rip out those toxic take-or-pay clauses. Third, there needs to be a massive push for cheap hydro capacity. They should be targeting around 20,000 megawatts by 2035. And lastly, implement some incredibly strict energy efficiency standards, because at the end of the day, the cheapest electricity in the world is the electricity you never actually use.
But honestly, none of this is going to work unless they finish what they started back in the 90s. They have to complete the unbundling. The whole sector desperately needs a genuine, real-time competitive wholesale market where generators actually have to compete with each other on price. And look, if the government really wants to subsidize power for the poor, that's fine, but they need to pay for it transparently. It should come straight out of the national budget rather than hiding those costs deep inside the energy system and just letting that circular debt rot from the inside out.
Which leaves us with this final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. Will the power sector just remain a piggy bank for political patronage, or will the necessary political will finally be found to turn it back into the backbone of national development? The path forward is super clear, but ultimately, that choice is up to the policymakers. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this deep dive helped bring a little clarity to a seriously complex issue. See you next time.